37 days. That is all the time it took for one man's death to pull 17 million people into their graves. Sarajevo, June 28th. Archduke Franz Ferdinand rode an open car through cheering crowds, and a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip was waiting on the corner. 2 shots. 6 weeks later, 23 nations were at war. The alliances, the ultimatums, the mobilization timetables. A machine so perfectly wound it could not be stopped. In the next 8 minutes, we walk every single link in that chain, from the bullet to the trenches. There is a moment, brief, irreversible, when the world stands on the edge of something it cannot yet name. Sunday, the 28th of June, 1914. In Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, the summer air was warm and full of promise. The Archduke was coming. The streets had been decorated. The crowds had gathered. And somewhere in that same crowd, patient, trembling, resolved, stood a young man with a pistol and a cause he believed greater than his own life. Within the hour, 2 shots would be fired. Within 6 weeks, the world would be at war. And for such a stupid reason, too. To understand how a single pistol shot in a provincial Balkan city could ignite a war consuming the whole of Europe, one must first understand the nature of the world that received it. Europe in 1914 was not merely a collection of nations. It was a system, rigid, interlocking, loaded with expectation and mutual suspicion. Like a vast machine wound so tight that the smallest jolt could set it grinding. At its heart lay the great alliance system that Bismarck had constructed, and that his successors had allowed to calcify into something far more dangerous. The Triple Alliance bound Germany to Austria-Hungary and Italy. The Triple Entente drew France, Russia, and Britain into one another's orbit. Every nation had pledged its honor, its armies, and its fate to others. Peace, in such a world, was only ever the postponement of catastrophe. And nowhere was catastrophe more patient, more certain, more inevitable than in the Balkans. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 had reshuffled the map of southeastern Europe with brutal speed. The Ottoman Empire, that ancient and crumbling power which had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia, had been driven almost entirely from Europe. In its place, new nations, ambitious, quarrelsome, hungry, jostled for territory and recognition. Serbia had emerged from these wars transformed. She had nearly doubled her territory. Her army, tested in battle, was confident and growing. Her people burned with a sense of destiny, the conviction that the Slavic peoples of the Balkans, scattered across the borders of the Austrian Empire, would one day be united under Serbian leadership. This was the dream. It was also, to Austria-Hungary, a nightmare. The Austrian Empire, that great multinational patchwork of peoples and languages and loyalties, had watched Serbia's rise with a dread bordering on fury. Within her own borders, the Slavic populations, Czechs, Poles, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, were restless. The dream of a greater Serbia, spreading its influence across Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories Austria had only recently annexed, was to Vienna not merely a political inconvenience, but an existential threat. Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, was 83 years old. He had reigned since 1848. He had seen empires rise and fall. He had buried a wife, a son, and a brother. He was, by 1914, a man of immense exhaustion wearing the mask of immense dignity. But the men around him, his ministers, his generals, his chief of staff Conrad von Hötzendorf, were men of a different temper. They were men who believed that Serbia must be crushed, and crushed soon, before the infection spread further. Conrad had urged war against Serbia no fewer than 25 times in the previous 2 years. 25 times he had been refused. He was waiting for his moment. Against this imperial weight, this vast machinery of state and army and tradition, there stood a boy. Gavrilo Princip was 19 years old. He was slight, pale, and serious. He had grown up in Bosnia, a subject of the Austrian Empire, and he had come of age in an era when Serbian nationalism was not merely a political opinion, but a sacred creed. He had read the pamphlets, attended the meetings, breathed the air of a generation that believed, with the absolute certainty of the young, that the Austrian Empire was an injustice written in blood across the map of Europe, and that it was the duty of every true Slav to resist it. He had come to Sarajevo that June morning as a member of a small conspiratorial group. Young men, most of them teenagers, who had been given pistols and cyanide capsules and positioned along the route of the Archduke's motorcade. Their plan was improvised, their nerves frayed, their preparation amateurish. Most of them, had things gone differently, would have grown old obscurely and died in their beds. History, however, had other intentions. The Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian throne, had come to Sarajevo on an inspection tour of the military maneuvers. It was, by coincidence, or perhaps by a certain imperial arrogance that mistook Sarajevo for a city of loyal subjects, the feast day of St. Vitus, to Serbian memory. St. Vitus's Day was the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, the great medieval defeat that had passed into national myth as both wound and rallying cry. To hold Austrian military maneuvers on such a day, in such a city, was to wave a red flag at a wounded bull. Franz Ferdinand was not, in truth, a man who invited affection. He was stiff, formal, and possessed of a temper that could strip paint from walls. But he was also, by the lights of his time and his position, a thoughtful man. He had opposed Conrad's plans for war against Serbia. He understood, as some of his colleagues did not, that a war with Serbia meant a war with Russia, and a war with Russia meant something beyond calculation. He had driven his wife Sophie to Sarajevo in an open car because he wanted to show the world that he was unafraid. That morning, the conspiracy nearly unraveled before it began. One of the young conspirators had thrown a bomb at the Archduke's car. It bounced off the folded hood and exploded beneath the following vehicle, injuring several of the Archduke's staff. Franz Ferdinand arrived at the town hall shaken but unhurt, and delivered his speech with the controlled fury of a man trying very hard not to shout. After the ceremony, the Archduke insisted on going to visit the officers who had been injured in the hospital. The motorcade changed its route. Nobody, it seems, thought to inform the drivers. The lead car turned into Franz Joseph Street, the wrong street. The driver was told to stop and reverse. And there, standing at the corner, outside Schiller's Delicatessen, a sandwich in his hand, was Gavrilo Princip. He had given up. He had assumed the attempt had failed. He had not moved from the spot, but only because his legs did not carry him away in time. He raised his pistol. He fired twice. The first bullet struck the Archduke in the jugular vein. The second struck his wife Sophie in the abdomen. Within 15 minutes of those shots, both were dead. Princip swallowed his cyanide capsule. It made him sick but did not kill him. He was 17 days too young to be executed under Austrian law. He would die in prison 4 years later of tuberculosis, weighing under 40 kilograms. He had, in those 2 seconds, changed the world beyond all recognition. Vienna's reaction was not immediate. It was calculated. The Austrian government knew what it wished to do. It wished to punish Serbia, to crush her, to end forever the Serbian dream of a greater Slav state on Austria's doorstep. But it also knew that it could not move without Germany's support, for Serbia's ally was Russia, and Russia was a power Austria alone could not face. And so Count Berchtold, the Austrian foreign minister, a man whom even his admirers described as indecisive, went to Berlin. He came back with what historians would later call the blank check. Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II and his Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg gave Austria their unconditional support. Whatever Austria decided to do, Germany would stand behind her. It was an assurance of extraordinary recklessness. An open-ended guarantee to an ally whose judgment was openly questioned even by those who gave the guarantee. The Kaiser was at this moment preparing to go on his annual sailing holiday. He departed. His generals and ministers reassured him that Russia would not intervene, that Austria would act quickly, and that the whole affair would be settled before the summer was out. They were wrong about everything. Serbia was small, but she was not naive. Her Prime Minister Nikola Pašic knew exactly what was coming. He had been warned by his ambassador in Vienna that Austria intended to make demands that no sovereign state could accept. He sent what feelers he could to the great powers. He waited. On the 23rd of July 1914, 25 days after the assassination, Austria delivered her ultimatum to Serbia. It was an extraordinary document. It had been deliberately designed to be unacceptable. Its demands required Serbia to suppress all anti-Austrian organizations, to dismiss officials identified by Austria, to allow Austrian officials to participate in Serbian judicial proceedings on Serbian soil, and to accept Austrian supervision of the investigation into the assassination. Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, who had spent years trying to hold the European peace together with the threads of diplomacy, read the ultimatum and said quietly that it was the most formidable document he had ever seen, one state addressed to another. It was, in every meaningful sense, a demand for the surrender of Serbian sovereignty. And yet Serbia, against every expectation, accepted nearly all of it. The Serbian reply conceded on point after point. On the single clause it could not accept, the presence of Austrian officials on Serbian soil conducting judicial proceedings. It offered instead to submit the matter to the International Court at The Hague. It was, by any ordinary diplomatic standard, a capitulation. Even the Kaiser, when he read the Serbian reply in his holiday retreat, wrote in the margin of the document, "A great moral success for Vienna." But with it, every reason for war is removed. He suggested Austria accept it. He was ignored. Austria declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July 1914. 1 month after the assassination, almost to the day. It was, at that moment, still possible to contain the conflict. A war between Austria and Serbia was a Balkan affair, serious, destructive, but limited. Europe had survived Balkan wars before. What made this one different was the chain reaction it triggered, a reaction that the men who set it in motion seemed, with a kind of collective sleepwalking, neither able to anticipate nor willing to prevent. Russia could not stand by. The Tsar, Nicholas II, was personally and politically committed to the protection of Slavic peoples. Serbia was not merely an ally, she was, to Russian eyes, a symbol of Slavic brotherhood. To allow Austria to crush Serbia without response would be to abandon Russia's claim to leadership of the Slavic world. It would also, his generals told him, be to invite the permanent encirclement of Russia by hostile powers. Russia began to mobilize. Russia's mobilization was the key that unlocked the European war. For Germany, a Russian mobilization on the eastern frontier meant only one thing: the nightmare scenario that her strategists had feared and planned against for decades. If Russia mobilized, France would mobilize too, and Germany would find herself fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Germany had one plan to deal with this, the Schlieffen Plan, named for the former chief of the German General Staff. The plan called for Germany to knock France out of the war quickly, within 6 weeks, if possible, by launching a massive attack through Belgium and Luxembourg, sweeping around behind the French armies and taking Paris, before turning all her forces east to deal with Russia. The plan was precise, tightly timed, and left almost no room for political intervention once it was set in motion. The problem was Belgium. Belgium was a neutral country, her neutrality guaranteed by treaty, a treaty to which Britain, France, Prussia, Russia, and Austria had all been signatories since 1839. For Germany to march through Belgium was not merely a military maneuver, it was the violation of a solemn international commitment. Bethmann Hollweg, the German chancellor, when confronted by the British ambassador with this fact, is said to have replied with disbelief that Britain would go to war over a scrap of paper. He had badly misjudged Britain. Britain's entry into the war was not inevitable, not even at the last moment. The cabinet was divided. The Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, a man of formidable intellect and considerable caution, held his government together by careful management and deliberate delay. Several of his ministers believed that Britain had no obligation to enter a continental war between Austria and Serbia, between Germany and France, between Germany and Russia. The Liberal Party had a deep tradition of non-intervention. The labor movement was opposed to the war outright. Sir Edward Grey argued otherwise. He had spent the crisis days of late July in a desperate attempt to bring the great powers to a conference table, to halt the machinery before it could not be stopped. He had failed, and now he faced his cabinet with the simple and terrible argument that Britain's word was at stake, her treaty commitments were at stake, and that a Europe dominated by a victorious Germany was a Europe no British government could contemplate with equanimity. On the evening of the 3rd of August 1914, Grey rose in the House of Commons to address members of Parliament who knew that their votes that night might send the nation to war. He spoke quietly, without theatrical flourish, for over an hour. He laid out the arguments. He described the Entente with France, the guarantee to Belgium, the position of Britain if she stood aside and allowed Europe to be reshaped by German power. And he said something that the House received in silence, with a weight that those present would remember for the rest of their lives. Last week I stated that we were working for peace not only for this country, but to preserve the peace of Europe. Today events move so rapidly that it is exceedingly difficult to address them. We are going to suffer, I am afraid, terribly in this war, whether we are in it or not. That night, Germany was asked by Britain to confirm her intention to respect Belgian neutrality. Germany could not confirm it. Her armies were already moving. At 11 o'clock on the night of the 4th of August 1914, Britain's ultimatum to Germany expired without reply. Britain was at war. In later years, those who had lived through that August would speak of it as two separate countries existing simultaneously, the last summer and the first war, overlapping for a few strange weeks before the old world vanished entirely. In the villages of France, the harvest was ripening in the fields. In the parks of London, couples walked in the evening light. In the cafes of Vienna, the newspapers carried the mobilization orders alongside the concert programs. In the towns of Germany, men kissed their wives and mothers and marched to the stations in the golden light of the most beautiful August anyone could remember. They did not know what they were walking into. No one did. The generals had their plans. The statesmen had their assurances and their calculations. The newspapers had their certainties. The volunteers had their patriotism, their sense of adventure, their conviction, shared by almost every man in every uniform on every side, that it would be over by Christmas. None of them could know that what was beginning was not a swift and decisive European conflict of the kind that Bismarck had conducted and ended in neat, bounded campaigns. What was beginning was 4 years of industrial slaughter on a scale no previous war in human history had approached. What was beginning was the thing that would hollow out a generation, rearrange the map of the world, bring down 4 empires, and make possible, in the wreckage, the rise of tyrannies that would eventually produce another war worse than this one. There is a question that has occupied historians for over a century. Who was responsible? Was it Austria, whose ultimatum was designed to be refused? Was it Germany, whose blank check made Austrian aggression possible? Was it Russia whose mobilization transformed a Balkan quarrel into a continental war? Was it the alliance system itself, that great interlocking mechanism that ensured no single shot could be fired anywhere without reverberating everywhere? Was it, as some would later say, nobody's fault, or everyone's fault simultaneously? The result of miscalculation, misreading, rigidity of plan, failure of communication, the sheer mechanical momentum of mobilization schedules that once begun could not be reversed? Perhaps all of these things, perhaps none of them fully. What is certain is this: the men who made the decisions that led to the war, in Vienna, in Berlin, in St. Petersburg, in London, in Paris, did not, most of them, want the war they got. They wanted something else: a diplomatic victory, a chastened Serbia, a managed crisis, a demonstration of resolve that would not need to become a war. They pulled levers they did not fully understand, in a machine they had built themselves but had never actually run at full speed, and they were astonished by what came out the other end. Asquith's secretary recorded in her diary that when the declaration of war was announced, the Prime Minister sat alone in his room for a long while without speaking. He was, she wrote, deeply moved. History is made by governments and generals, but it is lived by ordinary men and women who did not choose it and could not stop it. In the last days of July and the first days of August 1914, across every nation that would soon be at war, ordinary people wrote letters and diary entries that have survived them by more than a century. They wrote to fathers and mothers, to sweethearts and friends. They wrote in kitchens and barracks, in railway carriages and village post offices. They wrote without knowing, most of them, what was truly coming. And yet something in what they wrote suggests that somewhere beneath the patriotism and the excitement and the solemn sense of duty, they felt it. A young German student, Heinrich Hahn, wrote to his mother from his barracks in Cologne on the 1st of August. "We march tomorrow. I am not afraid, or rather I am afraid, but I do not think it matters. What matters is that I go. Please do not cry, Mama. I will be home before the leaves turn." He was killed in Belgium 6 weeks later. He was 22 years old. A British officer, Lieutenant Edward Woodroffe of the Rifle Brigade, wrote in his diary on the 4th of August, the day of the declaration, these words: "So it has come. I cannot say I am surprised, though I had hoped until yesterday that it might still be avoided. I think of the men I will command, and I hope I am worthy of them. Whatever comes, I will not dishonor them." He survived the war but did not speak of it afterward. His diary was found after his death, in 1961, in a tin box beneath his bed. A French schoolteacher from Lyon, a woman named Marguerite Aubert, whose husband was called up in the first mobilization, wrote to her sister, "He left this morning on the 7 o'clock train. I stood on the platform until I could no longer see the smoke. The children do not fully understand. Perhaps that is a mercy. I understand too well, I think." These were not exceptional people. They were the ordinary fabric of the world that was about to be torn. Across the nations about to go to war, the pattern was the same. The same farewells at the same stations, the same promises to write, the same assurances that it would not last long, the same brave faces held in place by will alone until the trains turned the corner and the faces crumpled. The same children who did not understand, the same wives who understood too much. War is always spoken of in the language of nations and armies, of strategies and campaigns, of territories lost and taken. But it is always, underneath all that, a matter of individual human beings asked to go somewhere terrible, and individual human beings left behind to wait. The waiting, for many, would last 4 years. For others, the letter they dreaded would come before the season changed. The newspapers of every nation greeted the war with a certainty and a confidence that, in retrospect, seems almost incomprehensible. In Germany, the Berliner Tageblatt spoke of a nation rising to defend its honor. In France, Le Figaro proclaimed the sacred union of the French people against aggression. In Britain, the Times called it a war for the public law of Europe. In Austria, the Neue Freie Presse reported the streets of Vienna alive with patriotic fervor. And the fervor was real. That cannot be disputed and should not be condescended to. The young men who rushed to recruiting offices in London and Paris, who answered their mobilization papers in Berlin and Vienna, who gathered in the village squares of Russia and Serbia. They were not fools or dupes, most of them. They were products of their time and their upbringing, shaped by decades of national pride, of military pageantry, of an education that had taught them that honor and sacrifice and service to the nation were among the highest things a man could offer. They simply could not know what modern industrialized warfare would make of such sentiments. They had no frame of reference. No previous war in living memory had prepared them for what the machine gun and the artillery barrage and the barbed wire would do to human bodies advancing across open ground. The Franco-Prussian War had lasted months. The Boer War had been distant and colonial. The Russo-Japanese War had been fought far away, by other people, and its lessons, which were available to those who chose to read them, had been largely ignored by the European general staffs. They would learn, but the learning would cost more than any of them could yet imagine. It is tempting, and perhaps too easy, to mourn only the dead. 8.5 million soldiers, countless millions of civilians, names carved into stone in 10,000 villages from the Somme to the Dardanelles, from Flanders to Gallipoli. The loss is real, and it is staggering, and it deserves every monument that has ever been raised to it. But the war destroyed something else as well, something harder to name and harder to grieve because it left no graves and no monuments. It destroyed a particular kind of confidence in human progress. The 19th century had been, for much of Europe, an era of extraordinary advance. Science and medicine and technology had transformed daily life in ways that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. The telegraph had shrunk the world, the railway had connected it, electric light had pushed back the darkness, vaccination had begun to defeat disease, life expectancy was rising, literacy was spreading. The great universities and libraries and concert halls of Europe were producing art and knowledge and philosophy at a pace that felt, to those living through it, like humanity ascending. There was a belief, not universal, not unchallenged, but genuinely widespread among the educated classes of Europe, that the direction of history was broadly upward. That civilization was advancing. That reason and law and diplomacy would, in the long run, prevail over barbarism and violence. That war between the great European powers was becoming, if not impossible, then at least increasingly improbable. Too economically destructive, too contrary to the interests of modern industrial states. The philosopher Bertrand Russell, looking back from the other side of the war, wrote of the world before 1914 with an anguish that comes through even in measured prose. It was, he said, a world in which people of his generation genuinely believed they were watching humanity mature, watching the long, slow emergence of reason from superstition, of law from violence, of international cooperation from narrow nationalism. The war did not merely kill men, it killed that belief. What replaced it? In the wreckage of the old certainties, among the populations of nations that had sacrificed a generation and gained nothing but exhaustion and grief, was something darker and more volatile. Bitterness. Resentment. The conviction that the old order had lied, had sent men to die for abstractions, had wasted the best of a generation on the altar of a conflict that need not have happened. Out of that bitterness, in the years after 1918, grew movements and ideologies that the pre-war world would have found almost literally unimaginable. The comfortable, progressive, law-abiding Europe of 1913 could not have produced Adolf Hitler. The war produced him. Or rather, the war, and the peace that followed it, and the hatreds and humiliations and economic catastrophes that the peace set in motion, produced the conditions in which men like Hitler could flourish. The two great shots fired in Sarajevo in June 1914 did not merely start a war. They started a sequence of events that would not fully exhaust itself until another world war had been fought and won, until Europe lay in ruins for the second time in 30 years, until atomic bombs had been dropped on Japanese cities, and until the surviving nations of the world, shaken to their foundations, resolved to build something new from the wreckage. That resolution produced the United Nations. It produced the European project. It produced 70 years of peace among nations that had spent the previous century tearing each other apart. But that is far ahead of where we stand now. We stand in the summer of 1914. The war has just begun. The men marching to the stations do not know what awaits them. The women at the windows watching them go do not know how long they will wait, or whether the man they are watching will ever come back. The world that produced them. The world of certainty and progress, and Sunday afternoons, and the deep ordinary comfort of a life not yet interrupted by history. That world has perhaps 2 or 3 weeks left. No more. After that, everything changes. Everything. The summer ended. Across Europe, the armies moved into position. The great machine of the war, assembled from years of planning, of rivalry, of arrogance and fear and misunderstanding, began to turn. It would not stop for 4 years, 2 months, and 11 days. By the time it did, 8.5 million soldiers would be dead, 21 million more would be wounded. The Russian Empire would be gone. The German Empire would be gone. The Austro-Hungarian Empire would be gone. The Ottoman Empire would be gone. The old world, the world of Sunday bells and aristocratic carriages, and the certainty of God's order, would be gone with them. It had begun with 2 pistol shots in a Bosnian street, fired by a teenager who had given up hope and found his moment by accident. It would end in mud and wire and the silence of fields where nothing grew. And those who survived it would spend the rest of their lives asking the question that Bethmann Hollweg's secretary heard the German chancellor ask in the last days of July, his head in his hands, the crisis already beyond his power to stop. How did it all happen?